Even the wisest of kings are subject to life's pitfalls, and King David's legendary son Solomon was no exception. Behind his aura of wisdom and glory, there was a human fragility that slowly began to emerge, casting shadows over his reign. From his ascension to the throne until the final moments of his life, Solomon faced internal and external challenges that tested his wisdom and government. This is a fascinating journey about power, temptation, and redemption, where the king's majesty intertwines with the mysteries of the Queen of Sheba, revealing not only a man's greatness, but also his weaknesses. If you value deep stories and reflections on human nature, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Let's together uncover the secrets of Solomon's reign and expand this knowledge to more people. Solomon, a notable figure in biblical scriptures, is remembered for his incomparable wisdom, immense wealth, and central role in the construction of the majestic temple in Jerusalem. His ascension to the throne of Israel occurred amidst a turbulent scenario, marked by family intrigues after the death of his father, King David. Among these disputes, Adonijah, his half-brother, tried to usurp the throne. However, thanks to divine intervention through the prophet Nathan and the cunning of Bathsheba, Solomon, God's chosen one, was rightfully crowned king. This choice had already been revealed to David when God announced that Solomon would be his successor and responsible for building the temple in Jerusalem. In the first book of Chronicles, chapter 22, God explains to David, "You have shed much blood and fought many wars. You will not be the one to build a temple in my honor, for you have shed too much blood on the earth in my presence. However, you will have a son who will be a man of peace and tranquility. His name will be Solomon, and during his reign I will give peace and tranquility to Israel." Solomon's name itself, which means peace, reflects this promise of stability and prosperity that would mark the first years of his rule. Right at the beginning of his reign, Solomon stood out among the leaders of his time for his extraordinary wisdom. One of the most memorable moments of his life was the alliance he made with God in the first days of his governance. This alliance was sealed in a solemn manner, documented in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 3 to 14. The episode took place in Gibeon, where Solomon offered a large number of sacrifices to the Lord. That same night, God appeared to him in a dream and made him an extraordinary offer. "Ask me for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." Showing great humility, Solomon recognized the magnitude of the responsibility he carried in leading the people of Israel. He did not ask for riches, long life, or the defeat of his enemies. Instead, he asked for wisdom to judge justly and govern with discernment. Recognizing that only with divine guidance would he be able to make the right decisions for the good of his people. His choice to pursue wisdom above material possessions or personal ambitions reflected the character of a truly God-fearing leader committed to integrity and justice. God's response to this request was remarkable. God commended Solomon's choice and, in addition to granting him unparalleled wisdom, also promised him additional blessings, riches and honor beyond what any other king of Israel had ever received. This promise transformed Solomon into the most prosperous and admired monarch of his time, both for his justice and for the greatness that marked his reign. One of the most famous episodes that demonstrates Solomon's wisdom is the story of the two women who claimed motherhood of a baby. This account, found in the first book of Kings, chapter 3, verses 16 to 28, describes two women who lived together and gave birth at almost the same time. However, tragically, one of them lost her child during the night, and in desperation, exchanged the dead baby for the other woman's live baby. When dawn came, both were disputing the motherhood of the surviving child, each claiming to be the real mother. In search of justice, the women went to King Solomon so that he could resolve the impasse. Faced with such a delicate situation, Solomon, instead of making a hasty decision, proposed an unexpected and apparently cruel solution. He suggested that the baby be divided in half, with each woman receiving a part of the child. This proposal, although shocking, was a brilliant strategy to reveal the truth. The true mother, moved by unconditional love, immediately opposed the division of the child, preferring to hand him over to the other woman rather than see him die. The other woman, who was not the biological mother, agreed to the division, demonstrating her lack of bond with the baby. Upon hearing these answers, Solomon, with his unparalleled wisdom, proclaimed that the true mother was the one who preferred to give up her son to protect him. So he ordered that the baby be given to the woman who demonstrated genuine motherly love. This episode not only highlighted Solomon's wisdom and discernment, but also reinforced his reputation as a fair and wise judge, capable of handling the most difficult cases and bringing justice in unusual ways. However, in addition to his wisdom, Solomon is also widely recognized for his notable achievements, one of his grandest being the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem. The Temple, which would become the spiritual and cultural center of the Kingdom of Israel, symbolized God's continued presence among his people. The idea of building a temple was originally conceived by David, his father, but it was Solomon who had the responsibility to bring this project to fruition. The biblical narrative details the luxurious resources used in the construction, including precious stones, cedar wood from Lebanon, and large quantities of pure gold. Every detail of the temple reflected Solomon's devotion to God and his reverence for creating a place worthy of worshiping the Lord. The chosen location, Mount Moriah, was highly symbolic, as it was where Abraham, centuries before, demonstrated his obedience by almost sacrificing his son Isaac. Thus, Solomon's construction of the temple also represented the continuation of the special covenant between God and Israel. In addition to his religious and architectural achievements, Solomon was an astute diplomat, consolidating international alliances that brought prosperity and stability to his kingdom. A notable example of these alliances was the visit of the Queen of Sheba, recorded in the first book of Kings, chapter 10, verses 1 to 13, and in the second book of Chronicles, chapter 9, verses 1 to 12. Curious and admired by Solomon's fame, the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem to test the king's wisdom with difficult questions and intellectual challenges. The Bible reports that Solomon answered all his questions with clarity and depth, and there was nothing he could not explain. This visit further reinforced his reputation, not only as a wise king, but also as an internationally respected leader. The Queen of Sheba's trip to Jerusalem was a high-profile event, characterized by the display of an imposing caravan laden with vast wealth. The queen brought with her an abundance of rare spices, gold in significant quantities, and precious stones, demonstrating not only her admiration for Solomon's fame, but also the deep diplomatic character of her visit. The exchange of gifts between Solomon and the queen was not just a gesture of courtesy, but symbolized the consolidation of a political and commercial alliance that would benefit both kingdoms. This meeting marked the height of Solomon's diplomacy, who, in addition to receiving the Queen of Sheba, also established relations with other kingdoms throughout his reign. He established strategic alliances through marriages, a common custom at the time, marrying princesses from powerful nations such as Egypt and Phoenicia. These marriage alliances were crucial to ensuring peace and stability between the kingdoms, further strengthening Israel's position in the region. Solomon, with his political sagacity, knew that the success of a kingdom did not depend only on internal wisdom, but also on the ability to form external alliances that would guarantee the prosperity and security of his nation. However, despite his brilliance and wisdom, Solomon's reign was also marked by failures and transgressions that would have lasting consequences. Among Solomon's greatest mistakes was his involvement with foreign women, a practice that went directly against divine instructions. In the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, it is reported that Solomon, in addition to marrying Pharaoh's daughter, took many other foreign women for himself, including princesses from neighboring nations. These marriages, although advantageous from a political point of view, represented a great spiritual danger for Israel, as women brought with them their cultures and, mainly, their idolatrous religious practices. The presence of these foreign influences in Israel began to corrupt the people's monotheistic faith, and Solomon, who had initially been a devout leader, began to tolerate the worship of foreign gods in his kingdom. The gradual acceptance of these foreign influences had a negative impact on Solomon. As time passed, he began to tolerate, and eventually participate in, his wife's idolatrous worship, deviating from the strictly monotheistic path required by God. The culmination of this deviation was the construction of temples and altars dedicated to pagan deities in Jerusalem, an act that directly violated God's commandments and seriously compromised the spiritual character of his reign. Solomon's foreign wives exerted a powerful influence on him, leading him to allow pagan practices to flourish in Israel, something that caused great displeasure to God. It didn't take long for divine wrath to manifest itself, and from that point on, Solomon's kingdom began to decline. This tolerance of idolatry would mark the beginning of the end of his golden age, as the covenant he had with God was severely compromised. This apostasy, detailed in chapters 11 and 12 of the first book of Kings, deeply stained Solomon's last days, revealing the complexities and contradictions of his life and leadership. He who had been exalted for his wisdom and righteous leadership now saw his reign crumble, largely due to the choices he made throughout his life. As he grew older, the decisions Solomon had made early in his reign, especially regarding marriages to foreign women and the acceptance of idol worship, began to negatively impact his rule. The kingdom that was once known for its prosperity and glory began to deteriorate, and the people of Israel began to stray from God's path, adopting practices that would weaken the nation's spiritual and political identity. This mixture of glory and shadows that marked Solomon's final years serves as a powerful reminder of the temptations and dangers that even the wisest of kings can face. Although he was a man of unprecedented wisdom, he was also human, susceptible to the weaknesses and failures that afflict everyone. His involvement with the foreign gods of his pagan wives was the turning point that precipitated the kingdom's spiritual decline. This spiritual compromise weakened Israel's covenant with God, and the peace that had prevailed during much of her reign began to unravel. The blessings he had received, such as material prosperity and international recognition, became secondary as spiritual and moral challenges arose in his rule. Furthermore, God's wrath was manifested against Solomon as a result of his spiritual deviations, and he raised up adversaries to challenge the once invincible king. Among these adversaries, Jeroboam stood out, an official trusted by Solomon, who rebelled against him. Jeroboam was not just an ordinary official. He had gained Solomon's trust due to his abilities and loyalty. However, over time, as Solomon moved away from the principles that supported him, Jeroboam saw an opportunity to challenge the king's authority. Before long, Jeroboam became a prominent figure, leading a revolt that would culminate in the division of the kingdom of Israel. This event, which appeared to be a political rebellion, was premeditated by God as a response to Solomon's disobedience, and it had a profound impact on the future of the nation. Jeroboam would later take control of the northern tribes, a direct consequence of Solomon's failures. Even while Solomon was still alive, the kingdom was already beginning to fragment, outlining the future schism that would follow after his death. This moment of rebellion and conflict was not an isolated event, but the result of a series of poor spiritual decisions made by Solomon throughout his reign. The alliance he established with foreign women, contrary to God's instructions, was one of the main factors that triggered this crisis. By allowing his wives to bring their pagan religious practices to Israel, Solomon undermined the spiritual foundation that had sustained the nation since the days of Moses. Tolerance of idolatry, which began as a gesture of diplomacy and perhaps even personal indulgence, grew to the point of threatening the very heart of Israelite faith. Growing tension in the kingdom, both political and spiritual, marked the last years of Solomon's reign. The luster of its early years, when the temple was built and peace reigned over Israel, began to fade as the northern tribes resented the centralization of power in Jerusalem and the pagan influences that infiltrated society. The wisdom that Solomon valued so much seemed to be slipping away as he moved away from his initial loyalty to God. By the end of his reign, What had once been a united and prosperous kingdom was on the brink of division and spiritual collapse. The kingdom that was once the jewel in Israel's crown began to show deep cracks in its foundation, resulting in discontent among the people. After 40 years on the throne, Solomon passed away, ending an era of great prosperity and splendor, but also of increasing moral and spiritual decline. His legacy, in fact, included the majestic construction of the temple in Jerusalem, which would become the epicenter of faith and worship of God for generations, a symbol of his early devotion and visionary leadership. During much of his reign, Israel experienced unprecedented peace and abundance, becoming an influential and respected nation in the region. However, as we look at the end of his life, we notice that, despite great material and political achievements, Solomon's reign ended with a shadow of unrest and dissatisfaction. The material and political splendor he built was accompanied by a spiritual deterioration that would ultimately weaken the kingdom. The Bible does not provide precise details about the cause of his death, suggesting that perhaps it was not the event itself, but the legacy he left behind that was more important. In the first book of Kings, chapter 11, verses 41 to 43, it is recorded that the rest of the history of Solomon, all that he did and the wisdom that he demonstrated, is written in the book of the Acts of the Kings of Israel. This verse seems to reflect both Solomon's impressive feats and the recognition that, despite his wisdom, he was also a fallible man. The text continues, stating that the days that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel were 40 years. Afterwards he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father. Rehoboam his son was his successor. Solomon's death marked the beginning of a tumultuous transition, and his son Rehoboam inherited a kingdom that was already fragmented both spiritually and politically. Unlike his father, who united the kingdom under his wise yet flawed leadership in later years, Rehoboam was unable to maintain that unity. Soon after Rehoboam's accession to the throne, the problems that had arisen during Solomon's final years reached their breaking point. The northern tribes, dissatisfied with the centralization of power and fiscal oppression, were led by Jeroboam in open revolt. The kingdom that Solomon had built with so much wealth and wisdom began to fall apart under the weight of the consequences of his father's wrong decisions. Jeroboam, Solomon's former trusted official who had led the rebellion, became the ruler of the 10 northern tribes, forming the kingdom of Israel. Meanwhile, Rehoboam ruled the southern kingdom, made up mainly of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, which would form the kingdom of Judah. This schism resulted in a divided nation with internal and external conflicts that would shape the history of Israel for centuries to come. The initial promise of a reign of peace and prosperity was disrupted by the reality of a fragmented kingdom, where tensions between north and south became the norm. What was once a unified nation under Solomon's wise rule now found itself divided and plunged into crises that would result in civil wars and a weakening of power. Solomon's story ultimately serves as a powerful reminder of the lasting implications of a leader's ethical and spiritual choices, and how even the wisest and most blessed can stray from their path when they lose sight of their principles. Although Solomon was celebrated for his incomparable wisdom, vast achievements, and a reign marked by glory and prosperity, his mistakes at the end of his life reveal the profound consequences that misguided choices can have, both for himself and the nation he ruled. The fact that a man so gifted with insight and understanding has, over the years, strayed from the values that initially defined his reign is a reminder not only of human weaknesses, but also of how power and external pressures can erode the integrity of solid leadership. The political alliances that Solomon made with foreign women, although advantageous from a diplomatic perspective, introduced practices and cultural influences that were strictly forbidden by God. Marriage to these women, princesses from pagan nations, not only brought temporary political stability, but also opened the door to the acceptance of idolatrous practices in Israel. Idolatry, which began discreetly and seemingly harmlessly, infiltrated Israelite culture, undermining the spiritual foundations on which the kingdom had been built. Solomon, who initially resisted these influences, eventually succumbed to them, allowing the construction of altars to foreign gods. What began as an attempt to maintain peace with neighboring nations quickly turned into a spiritual compromise that profoundly affected the people's relationship with God. These choices not only compromised Solomon's spiritual integrity, but also weakened his moral authority as a leader. The reign that had once been an example of justice, wisdom, and faithfulness to God gradually turned into a period of spiritual and moral confusion. The tolerance Solomon demonstrated toward idolatry not only weakened his own faith, but also set a dangerous precedent for subsequent generations. The people, who saw the king as a model to be followed, began to stray, adopting pagan practices and moving away from the God of Israel. This resulted in an environment of increasing internal division, where the northern tribes began to resent the centralization of power in Jerusalem and the foreign influences that permeated the kingdom. This spiritual weakening had serious and lasting consequences. Solomon's spiritual decisions, particularly his tolerance of idolatry and his lack of steadfastness in maintaining exclusive devotion to God, opened the door to the fragmentation of the kingdom. The united kingdom that he had inherited from David and that he himself had expanded and strengthened began to fall apart under the weight of these influences. The schism between the northern and southern tribes, which would culminate after his death, was a direct consequence of his spiritual and political decisions in the last years of his reign. This fragmentation was not just political. It was a spiritual rupture that divided Israel into two separate and eventually weakened kingdoms. Solomon's glorious reign, which had begun with so much potential and prosperity, ended marked by disunity, corruption, and loss of fidelity to God. While his legacy of wisdom and material achievement remains unchallenged, the Temple of Jerusalem, his masterpiece, is still remembered as one of the greatest feats of architecture and faith in antiquity. The final years of his life serve as a solemn warning about the dangers of spiritual complacency and deviation from essential values. The grandeur of his achievements was not enough to prevent the consequences of his spiritual failures, demonstrating that material success, without the support of a solid moral foundation, can be fleeting. Solomon, the wise king who began his life ruling with discernment and justice, ended his reign as a leader who allowed his vision to be clouded by outside influences and personal desires. This story reminds us that regardless of our achievements, true wisdom lies not only in knowledge and the ability to govern, but also in the ability to hold true to the principles that guide us. Human frailty, when not recognized and corrected, can lead even the most powerful to fall. Solomon teaches us that the decisions we make today, especially regarding our faith and morality, have the power to shape not just the present, but the future of a nation and a generation. His mistakes at the end of his life are a powerful warning that spiritual integrity and fidelity to God cannot be neglected, as they are the pillars that support both personal life and the leadership of a people. If you've made it this far, it's because Solomon's story touched something in your heart. The legacy he left behind is a mix of wisdom, power, regret, and consequences. Therefore, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and leave your comments about what this story means to you. Your reflections are welcome, as we can all learn from Solomon's example and reflect on the decisions that shape our lives. May God bless your journey, and see you in the next video.